Yeah, I had also added KubeCon North America. The main KubeCon
Yes.
track is often very difficult to get into, and getting more so literally all the time. That said, um, I expect to see the co-located events go up shortly, and those are typically much more thematic and probably a much better fit for what we're doing.
Yes, and that would be a great great event to get a talk or two in. Yeah, I think most of the DEF CON main track CFP is closed. I know Policy Village merged with main track this year, so that's also closed, but some of the DEF CON villages may still be accepting proposals. So it may be worth folks poking at that if anyone wants to or is planning to be at DEF CON. My current plan is still not to be there this year. Have other obligations to attend to.
I think someone, I don't remember who, I think it was someone had mentioned that they were interested in doing something for Usenix security. And that still got a little bit of time on its CFP deadline.
Frederick, I see your hand up.
I do. And so in terms of KubeCon, one of the things that I intend to do is to give a keynote that's primarily around supply chain, software supply chain related topic. And I want to try to find a thoughtful way to make sure that we get OmniBOR as part of that. So I don't want to be the main topic at the moment, but as I am working through that, I would definitely appreciate advice and any feedback as the work progresses there.
So, and for those of you who are unaware, Frederick is not just incredibly confident in his talks being accepted. He is actually the co-chair of KubeCon North America 2023. And as such, I believe you get a keynote in passing. That's just part of the role.
I have a guaranteed 15-minute keynote. I don't have full control over what I want to say in that particular scenario. Although I guess I do, because once I get up there, they can't stop me. But in spirit of following the processes that I help manage, I do want to make sure that I'm careful with that. But yeah, I basically do have a guaranteed slot in that particular area. It's 15 minutes long, and certainly enough time to show OmniBOR as part of a broader set of patterns that can be used to help in that particular path.
Cool. Excellent.
Awesome. Okay. I don't see any other hands up, so if anyone has other topics on events and CFPs.
There was one other thing that went by on the RustConf stuff. I know at one point, Andrew, you had ambitions towards getting something submitted for RustConf on OmniBOR with the goal of having some kind of a POC to show of OmniBOR working in the Rust compiler. And I know that for reasons that happened to all of us, you know, life got in the way, and you came to that realization in a very graceful manner and demurred on that ambition. I wonder if it still makes sense to see if we can maybe get something POC-shaped pulled together, at least to show at hallway level in time for RustConf. I not in the sense that having goals that are data-oriented sometimes focuses the mind and helps move things forward.
Yeah. Right, and that's, so I'm trying to think, RustConf is, normally it's August, I think it's September this year though. Let's see.
Barely. It's barely
September. Oh, yeah, I have it right there, 9/1. Yeah. Oh wait, actually it's 9/12 to 15.
Oh,
okay.
I will update that.
Already got it.
And this year it is in Albuquerque, which is different. It's always been in Portland, Oregon previously. But I mean, yeah, I'm happy to shoot for that.
That sounds great. So let's let's see what we can do to try and get the necessary help and support so we can sort of move towards that goal, because I think that would be kind of a stunning thing to show folks, especially since we could probably, Rust has the nice benefit that it is compatible with the CABI, with the C runtime. So we can actually sort of string together C things into Rust things potentially as part of showing that.
Yeah. I imagine like a Python FFI plugin would be pretty, written in Rust would be pretty amazing and would gather a lot of attention, even if they don't care about the software supply chain itself.
Yeah.
That does get to be quite an interesting notion. It's like all the things.
So I just added a little note about that with the comment that, I mean, the first thing is going to be the OmniBOR crate currently doesn't, I mean, it hardly does anything. It started working on it and then it paused because I had a bunch of spec questions. But it's probably about time to go back and actually start working on it again.
Yeah, and if you need any help, if there are things that break out, I'm relatively new to Rust, but interested. Yeah, so I mean, and I imagine that there may be other folks running loose in that nature. And obviously, if you hit spec questions again, that's a good indicator that we have things to close in the spec. So
yeah, absolutely. I know that Nell and I had a couple of different times that we had sort of pair programmed on the Gitoid crate, and that was very productive and helpful. And I'd be happy to do similar things.
Well, that's awesome. Cool.
Also, I would like to try to make sure that we get the Go version to keep parity with the Rust version. Not to say that they have the exact same APIs, but general feature set and also the choice of wording. Now that we have the spec much further along, we should make sure that we're consistent with the terminology across both projects.
Agreed.
Yeah,
agreed.
And well, particularly in one of the things, and I keep meaning to make a pass through the rest of the spec for this, but one of the things, Andrew, that Ava and I did at the Open Source North America talk is we incorporated the input manifest languaging, which, I mean, it seems like such a small thing, but it turns out it does tremendous work for improving the understandability of the entire concept. There was a missing chunk there. And that fit directly into, and we sort of
the shape of the questions we got were substantially different, even from folks who only heard about it for the first time in the session, just by changing those words.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
But that also, I think, gets a bit to Frederick's point about terminology in the libraries and whatnot.
Yeah. Which reminds me to say that I have it on my, as soon as a few other things clear up, go rewrite the spec itself, which is still it's about a year-old draft at this point, to incorporate all the new terminology and language we have. Sorry, not the spec, the white paper. My bad. To rewrite the white paper based on updates in the spec.
Yeah, and I will mention that in parallel, and please do not block on this, in parallel, I've been sort of poking at writing some stuff also for the website that incorporates some of those pieces. But please do not block on that for a couple of reasons. One, the timing of that is somewhat unreliable. But two, you and I tend to express things just differently enough that it makes the world on net more understandable.
Different perspectives pointing at the same elephant. Yep. So we're about 10 minutes into the proper meeting. I'd like to nudge us a little bit forward. We've kind of been talking about communities and languages and for a little bit. Do we have any news to share on the build tool and community outreach other than, Rust and Go?
So I think we had a really good Python demo last week.
We did.
And I think Robert Marion was starting to think about reaching out towards the Python community from that. And so I'm not sure what's going on with that currently, but that I think is probably probably a goodness. But I think part of it also was, oh wait, I remember, I took an action item to reach out to Julia, who actually knows people in that community, to see if we could facilitate that connection.
I may actually pick up that baton, as there's a little bit, not to cross the streams too much, but there's an overlap with some PSF, some other work happening in the PSF that I might be able to dovetail this in, at least the conversation, and then figure out who to route it to.
Okay.
So I'm gonna make a note for myself on that.
Okay.
Okay. I will try and do that today.
Yep. Cool. So apologies. Have you passed the baton to me, Ava, or are you still feeling up to holding the baton on leading the meeting?
I am attempting to keep us at least on time.
I am delighted to have you carry the baton to whatever degree you feel up to.
Okay. So with no other comments on outreach, Andrew, you've got a section here on cleaning up the meeting notes.
Yeah, this is just like little stuff that I noticed at the top that, you know, were things I felt were maybe either out of date or sort of worth changing. Yeah, so the first is just get bomb in the title. I think, are we fine removing it? You know, it's sort of like, currently it's crossed out at the beginning of the meeting notes. And then similarly, I see that there's the sort of action there for the links to the Google groups, and also about, you know, are we considering the Slack channel official? Right now it still says temporary until we move, but also been there for a while, and I don't know that there's active discussion of going somewhere else. And then also I just wasn't sure if we're still doing the spec tech alternating thing. I had some vague memory that we might have changed that.
On the spec tech alternating, I know we discussed it. I don't recall a decision either, but the last discussion that I recall converged on, well, if it isn't working, let's try just sort of seeing what works.
So I think the thing we were trying was basically, because at the time the tech meetings had slowed down a great deal. And so that's why we sort of tried adding POCs and questions from implementers as standing items early in the meeting. And did away with the distinction in effect, because it sort of allowed us to, in principle, move forward faster. I think we had a spurt recently of new POCs in terms of Java and Python, and also patch. I don't know if you've been around for the patch POC stuff, Andrew, but it makes me super happy because have you seen any of that work yet?
I have just tracked it from the context of seeing stuff happening on GitHub, but I have not been in the meetings for the discussion of it.
But the net is all the many places where people store pristine source code and then apply patches at build time. Imagine being able to track that whole process in the artifact dependency graph.
Yeah, that is very cool.
It's
so there's
very shiny.
There's a patched patch tool that does some of that,
Nice.
which makes me giggle a little bit. Who patches the patchers? Yeah. The other thing that I think slowed down / caused these to get a little bit merged is with conference season and summer, we've had a lot of meetings where a couple people are absent for a meeting or we skip a meeting. And so the strict alternation every other week between spec and tech just didn't hold. When we kept missing people, or one person who wanted to do a demo could only come to a spec meeting. I think it's working to keep them, the topics kind of mixed right now. But I'd also love to propose or ask if the lack of continuity of having everybody present in every meeting, we're not going to get that. We're all busy people.
Well, there are certain things that are what I would refer to as somewhat contentious. And I have a standing rule that I don't think it's appropriate to argue a position that someone feels strongly differently about when they're not in the room.
Mhm.
It's just unfair.
Agree.
And so, for example, I know that there's a standing discussion that we've had about proposal to only generate OmniBOR when OmniBOR dir is specified. And you have some strong feelings about that, Ava.
Yeah.
And I believe that my feelings are not in alignment with yours. And so, for example, when this has come up, when you have not been present and I have been present, I have generally demurred on the discussion. I have also at times not been present when you have been present. I don't know exactly what happened in regard to it there, but would not be surprised to find something similar.
Yep. I know a couple times you've not been present. We've had some discussions and I tried to capture all the notes, but nothing was decided. Nothing was taken off the standing agenda as a result of those. So without getting into those discussions yet, coming back to Andrew's question about cleaning up and structure of meetings, do we have any sort of a consensus about should we continue alternating or not?
I would suggest the question, given the current state, is slightly different, which is, do we have a consensus that we want to go back to alternating? Because I think the current state of the world is POC and questions from implementers being open spaces early in the meeting, and otherwise having a blended meeting.
Yeah, that's a better framing than I had. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I personally like the blended meeting thing as a concept. I think that at least of late, it hasn't been an issue where we've had like, a bunch of proof of concept stuff that ends up pushing spec stuff off of the agenda entirely. We might, if that does become a problem, adjust and say, hey, we're only going to do, X number of minutes on proof of concept. And if we run out, then it just gets, held for the next meeting, or, we have some other adjustment. But yeah, I don't know. I kind of like the blending.
Yeah, I'm also kind of a fan of the blending, frankly. And I think we had, as I said, sort of a spurt of POCs, and then that's going to ebb and flow just naturally.
Okay. Not hearing any objection, I think we have a consensus to stick with the blended format for now. It's also been working well for me. Working backwards through your question list here, is there a plan for the minimum viable governance item? Is that a specific?
This is one of the things that's in that like box at the top of the meeting notes where it just says minimum viable governance TBD.
Okay.
And this is not necessarily something to decide right now, but it's more that I noticed that we have this TBD thing there, and I'm not sure exactly what's intended for it.
Yeah. I will go dig through the community specification license documentation and make sure that I is dotted or T is crossed. So I believe that's where it is referencing.
Okay. Cool. And then are we good with sort of removing reference to the Google groups, or do we want to sort of do something with those? Because I think they just generally don't get used. I guess this sort of also connects to the Slack decision. These aren't all, by the way, necessarily things to decide right in this moment. It was more just looking at the top and saying like, maybe there are things to do here.
Yeah. I mean, my general tendency is whatever we do with the Google groups, we should do them in both places. We don't seem to have evolved into a community that emails particularly.
Did we lose that? Oh, no,
Maybe
you're still there. It sounded like an audio cut and then your face froze. No, I agree. We haven't used email much for discussions. It seems to be mostly Slack meetings.
And now a little bit of using like GitHub discussions or issues. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy with deprioritizing them at the very least, or I don't know who owns them, or even like, officially sort of closing them. And I agree that if we're removing them from reference in the meeting note, they should be removed from the website as well.
I would like to point out that GitHub will happily do emails. So if someone wants to take the email path, they should be able to subscribe and manage their own email chain into some of the discussions. We could do a couple things there to increase the usefulness of that if people find that to be a good path around making sure that repos are properly split off so that they're not getting noise from things that they don't care about as much. But it is a possible path.
That's true.
Okay. So in the interest of time, I would suggest that we we roll back to some of these issues, having thought about them for a week or so, because I think they're excellent things to raise. Some of them are like obvious, okay, sure, like crossing out get from the title.
Done.
Cool.
So moving on to the NIST multi-cloud report, Frederick.
Hello. So there were two back-to-back NIST events last week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Tuesday and Thursday were the actual sessions. Wednesday was a set of workshops. I spoke on so Tuesday was OSCAL, Thursday was multi-cloud. The one on Thursday, just for people's information, was heavily themed around a few topics. The most obvious one is bringing in more service meshes, which is of less interest to this group. But there was also discussion. I gave a talk there specifically on software supply chain. There's work that I've been doing in that space for NIST, and part of what I've structured that got a really good reception was around two primary concepts. The first one is that we should aim towards evidence-based approaches as opposed to more ad hoc. So in other words, OmniBOR is a really good example of this, where the compiler produces evidence, we capture that evidence, we can then think about it or analyze at a later time. And they had a whole set of discussions around zero trust, and I found that tying software supply chain to have similar principles of zero trust is resonating well, in the sense that zero trust, you ideally produce evidence of an identity or of a device. You then have something authorize it, and then you automate the whole process. So there's no hands-on keyboard or click-off style approach. Same thing occurs within software supply chain. You produce evidence of what happened in the build, of what the inputs and outputs were. You then can, at a later time, analyze and authorize whether you want to make use of that thing or not, and again, fully automate the whole path. So that got really good attention. The second one was, I also started to see it in those communities that SBOM is not enough, that there's a whole range of other topics besides the SBOM, and it's important to not overextend the SBOM. So there were a lot of questions after the session about what was meant by that by several individuals. But the basic thing is, I wanted to provide a seed in there, so that in such a way that people will start thinking about what does it really mean to secure software, that it's not just having a list of ingredients, but to get people to a point where when we tell them about things like OmniBOR or other related projects, that they're no longer stuck on SBOM, one SBOM to rule all aspects of it. And I did see a shift in people's conversations after that. So we'll see how far that ends up going. But in short, that's there's also just one last part, which is that there was a lot of discussion around SPIFFE, which I know is not as important in this particular group, but considering some of the things that people are using to sign their systems use it, which is going to include OmniBOR. Like, how do you show that some OmniBOR thing was signed in the future and is tied to the things that they're supposed to? But in short, that's how the conference went.
Thank you for the update.
Cool.
So
if
reminds me of one event I did forget to mention, just in case it isn't on anyone's radar. The CISA SBOM ARAMA is coming up in a month and a half or so.
Last day to register is on June 10th, and I think it's sooner than a month and a half. Double check the date on that.
Yeah, I might be off by a bit. Sorry, you're right. It is in 2 weeks. I have the month wrong. It's June. It's mid-June, not mid-July. Yeah, June 14th. So
if I could make a suggestion, because it's something that's been hanging out there for a long time, where we've been trying to get the right people in the room to sort of resolve it, could we potentially bump up in time the proposal to generate OmniBOR only when the OmniBOR dir is specified?
I'm happy to.
Because I think it also relates to the location to store the OmniBOR docs, which I believe depends on the outcome of that discussion. Do other folks feel okay with moving that discussion up?
Perfect.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and open that up. And this is fairly simple in terms of a file change. It just involves adding to the spec the absence of the specification of the OmniBOR dir should be taken as a signal to skip the OmniBOR generation. The notion being that I suspect, and I know that we've got some comments here from Jeremy, but I suspect that it will be easier to get adoption by upstream compiler communities and linker communities and whatnot if this is a thing that only happens because there was some indication you wanted it. And I think we want to keep that indication as simple as possible and as consistent as possible across systems. But I can imagine more pushback from upstream communities if this is a thing that they would have to reason about the side effects for, because it is always happening.
I just had a question. So does this mean that the individual tools should not have command line option also to indicate the choice, or is it going, or is this, are we proposing that the only way to enable this is using an environment variable?
I think you basically hit on.
Yeah. If you look at line 42, 43, 44, it can be set by an env var or a build tool flag.
I thought it got removed. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah. No, it's just above that.
Okay.
Well, so Barathi's actually half right, because this third point.
Yeah, the wording on line 44 or the wording on line 46 don't quite comport, because it's not, there we go, that's the change. The absence of specification via either the OmniBOR dir environment variable or a build tool specific flag.
Okay, yeah, that's me.
Yeah.
I also am looking at the order of precedence, and that particular order may be confusing to many people who expect who expect concrete flags to override environment variables when they both.
That is true. That is true. Good catch. That order of precedence in most of the tooling I'm experienced with is reversed, but I don't want to assume that there aren't tools that allow an environment variable to override a flag.
That would be incredibly annoying behavior.
It would be, but somebody out there may have done that in their community in a very small niche that I don't know about.
I do like the use of the word should as well. That we should, it should remain a should.
Yeah, it should not be a must. Yeah. My concern here continues to be the adoption challenge. If a build tool picks this up and releases a new version that incorporates OmniBOR build capabilities, this PR would necessitate every single project, every company, everyone who's using that build tool to update their build environment. And that violates the the premise of the work in Spirit, which is make this require as close to zero effort as possible on the part of the long tail of individual contributors who are just building projects. They don't want to have to worry about supply chain stuff. They don't want a government, they don't want a company to call them up or send them a letter and say, we need you to update your Jenkins config.
So I've been sort of toying back and forth between the should versus may here. and part of what I'm thinking is that the way to split this may be that like anything else, you do it via fade-in process. Because initial adoption, there's a certain amount of conservativeness with regard to build tools, which overall is a good thing. The conservative approach would be if you don't ask for it, you don't get it. Should may be a little too strong here. I'm thinking perhaps making this a may. Might be a better approach, because if I recall correctly, I don't remember the RFC definition of may versus should, but effectively it's, and rather than telling the build tools that they shouldn't be doing this if they don't get indication of where to put the data, we're telling them that they may take that as a signal to skip the data, and it may make it easier for initial implementations to go in. Yep. And as people get more comfortable, easier to transition towards where I think you want to go,
yes, Ava. I am quite comfortable with that change. If the guidance here is the absence may be taken as a signal, then some build tools or language communities can choose to enforce it all the time unless turned off, and some can choose to enable it only when opted in. That becomes a domain-specific choice, which I think is appropriate. Some build tools, some language communities are going to want to lead the way and adopt this immediately, and some may take longer. That's okay. I think our guidance needs to allow for that flexibility.
So the other related question is, should any default location be permitted or not? Or is that also an option to the tool?
I would suggest, and the removal of what was line 45, I suggest we include a default of .adg, or, I'm not stuck on those three letters, but I do think we should include a default as a suggestion to build tool communities. Now, if they want to change it for some reason, that's fine. If people want to override it, that's fine, but we should include a default recommendation. And most will probably use that.
Okay. So I think Jeremy had a comment about that.
Which comment was that?
I highlighted it for convenience.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the problems. Like in a distributed build system, if you don't write something if the things you write aren't known to the build system, then they're likely just to get discarded anyway. So it's a wasted effort. So you have to have some amount of agreement between the tools and the build system in order for anything to work at all. I had another comment just on this particular fragment that we're looking at. The way that that's structured seems to imply that those are the only mechanisms that you could have. Like an obvious one that this doesn't directly cover is config files or something like that. So, the wording should at least say, here's some suggested mechanisms. Others are possible.
Okay. No, that's.
And I think
out of curiosity, though, and this is purely my own curiosity, is are there fundamental build tools, things like compilers, linkers, etc., that are garnering various information of this sort from config files? And I ask it out of curiosity because I'm not aware of any, and I'm a collector of such things.
So, no, not generally. Well, I mean, what I had in mind specifically is like build systems. So, I think the essential thing that is important here is that we're proposing that the OmniBOR environment variable is a tool agnostic universal way of enabling this functionality. And so if you have a build system like, say, CMake, that just enables OmniBOR and points at the place where it wants the output put, and then any tool that's capable of generating that output will put it there.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be like a fairly lightweight way of achieving Ava's goals of minimal, like it's not zero configuration, but it's sort of fairly generic. Yep. And it doesn't require you to individually modify the config for every single tool or the command line options or whatever. And that seems to be something like that would be driven from a CMake config file or whatever build system config file you have.
So that's, if everything was driven from the same CMake config file, yes, that would work. I'm also thinking of more complex build steps, let's say in a GitHub project that is being built on top of a cloud or by a series of cloud builders. There are multiple config files, one for each step, one for each layer of the build process. There might be 10 and 20. They might be managed by different teams. I would want this to be able to be turned on once at the beginning of that process, and the same the options and the storage location to all be inherited and compatible across those different steps.
So let me sort of roll a thought through my head, which is, and part of the reason I was also asking about config files is effectively the environment variables or command line flags are something that would need to be passed down through whatever the build orchestration or what you call the build system, Jeremy, is. And part of why I was asking about examples where there might be a config file in use is, I could imagine a situation where, say I'm a very large company with a very complicated, very ancient build system. I'm sure nobody on this call is part of a company like that, that has acquired many warts over the course of decades. I'm sure none of us know what that is like. And I'd like to turn this on. You could imagine if there were a config file I could tweak for the compiler and the linker, where it would consult that config file, independent of whatever the hell the build system has told it to do. That being of potential utility. The thing I would be concerned about, and this is something where I think Barathi and Vajislav have more insight, is such a thing going to be a complete alien to existing compilers? Do we have anything with existing compilers or linkers where they do have some sort of configuration file that they're reading instead of just taking everything from environment or command line flags?
No, there isn't a config file a given release of linker can always go consult for using certain options by default. But of course, you can provide all the options in a file, and you can pass that file to all the users of the tool chain. That is common. But again, you will have to, it's as good as providing that config file in an option through a make file or some other way. So it's, yeah, to my knowledge, there isn't like, you release this tool, it will always use this config and use these options unless you enable it in the tool chain itself.
Right. And in general, such a config file would be highly, highly, highly undesirable for a tool like a compiler or a linker, because you do not want the tool to change behavior in some way that's not visible to its inputs. And so, like in this particular case, I mean, we are kind of talking about that situation, right? Because the artifacts that are being emitted, they would be different by the presence or absence of this ADG directory, right?
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, so
so I guess you could have what's the situation? So if we assume that the tools always generate ADG output, if they are capable of it, regardless of whether or not you have any environment variable or config, then if you have a build system that is incredibly sensitive to tracking everything, then the fact that you upgraded the tool itself would be the change. Like version A of the tool does not generate OmniBOR artifacts. You upgrade it to version B and it does. That's fine, because the fact that you upgraded the tool is a material change to the build graph. And so the fact that the artifacts that are being generated are different is okay.
And some might consider that a minor or a major version bump requiring change of the build tool. Certainly, it's much more substantial of a change than a patch version change. David, I see your hand up. Do you have a comment on this conversation, or are you asking to change topics?
No, it is a couple of comments on this conversation.
Jump on in.
The first one, which is because compiler upgrades are maybe multifaceted, I would have an issue with having a materially changed side effect from the compiler upgrade, because you might be upgrading, because you get better optimization or something else. You don't want, if the upgrade is one of N changes, I would say it's still got to be opt-in rather than opt-out. In terms of the wording around configuration files, I would simply say that the location to write OmniBOR data via one of the OmniBOR dir, the build tool specific flag, or other mechanisms that are common to the specific build tool. So that gets us, if, right now we can't think of any examples of build tools that take configuration files as a parameter. There may exist ones out there today. Maybe they're not compilers, but maybe there are other things that, if we think, for example, of a Helm chart, would a Helm, would part of deploying via a Helm chart also deploy artifacts or copy artifacts over, or be part of this overall ecosystem? So I will have open language there.
So I am thinking specifically of both GitHub and its various ways of automating build pipelines, which are now beginning to automatically emit evidence that this GitHub runner performed these tasks on this commit of this project on this machine, signed with this hardware key in this environment on this operating system. Like, it's a deep attestation, then signed and published. So that type of, it just turned on for all of GitHub automation. I'm also thinking of Azure DevOps pipelines. Right? Anyone who's using that can define multiple stages in a build. It's all a YAML config file. So the question of do build tools take config files? Maybe not the C compiler, but certainly the build engine that's calling into the compiler. Obviously Jenkins has config files, right?
So I do want to point out that as a matter of precision of language, we have a tendency to refer to things like compilers, linkers, and runtimes as build tools, and to refer to the broader systems that execute and order those build tools either as build orchestrators or build systems or something like that.
Yep.
And the reason I think that's an important distinction to draw is that, like, confusing something like make with something like GCC produces all kinds of problems.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm not saying that it produces all kinds of problems. And so the distinction may be useful to make sure we maintain. Really quick check from Dave. This language check to set by one of that I put as a suggestion here, does that sort of get at the first part of what you were suggesting?
Yes.
And then
but I do like the precedence language because I think that's important to say. We're going to define the precedence, but the precedence may include different things.
Well, so the trick with precedence is, and I think this gets back to the question as well, we may have them in the wrong order if precedence is what we want, because I think there was comments from several people that build tool specific flags should override environment variables. Did I get that correctly?
Yes.
More specific should override more general.
So this becomes, and so this, I think, gets closer to the current set of precedents that people are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think here you were suggesting that we make this something like that. The language itself may be a little bit schlocky currently, but I wanted to make sure we captured the concept.
Yes, that works for me.
I think I'm not understanding the change. Top of your screen there, Ed. What is changed in the suggestion here? I think it's a question to David.
The change is specifying that it's one of, but we're actually specifying the order of precedence that a tool will select. So the top precedence is a command line flag.
Yes.
The second order of precedence is an environment variable. The third order of precedence is the existence of a directory. The fourth order of precedence is other tool specific mechanisms for setting tool state or tool function. So that gets into the config file.
If I could make a suggestion that this may be simpler as a phrasing,
yeah,
the OmniBOR door may be set in order of precedence by.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That works. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah. So sorry for being an anal lawyer. I'll not go to law school.
Oh. We are just approaching the end of the meeting, so I think we have a couple interesting changes here, mostly changing shoulds to mays and changing the order of things.
If I could make a suggestion, do we feel comfortable enough with these changes that I can go back and redo the PR to include them?
OmniBOR
I can't hear you, Bharati. Could you try again?
lost connection. Am I audible now?
Yes. Yes, you are.
So I was just saying that if the OmniBOR can be set in one of the following ways, and the build tool does it have the choice to choose a default location to write the OmniBOR? If not, it would be great if that is also clarified. The reason I'm asking is, suppose the location of OmniBOR is specified as invalid, then you just don't generate at all. You error out, or you default to the default location.
So that's an interesting question, and what I don't think we have time to resolve in this discussion. Okay. Let me stick a comment here so we don't lose the thought. And I would encourage folks to sort of stick their thoughts there in that train as well. And we can roll back around to this. I would like to try and drive this to at least a point where we can move the ball forward next time. That hopefully will involve resolving the default location question, but that question may need to be pushed out to a different PR with proposals. Does that feel okay to folks?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Because I think other than the problem is the default location ends up being a complicated question in my mind for reasons, some of which Jeremy has raised, and others of which I suspect are bouncing in the back of Jeremy's brain, but haven't been raised.
We are at the top of the hour. Thank you all, folks. Ed, I think it's a good call to continue drilling down on this until we can close it.
Cool.
Awesome. See you all next week. Thanks a bunch.
Thanks, y'all.